The sun hung low over the Bavarian forest on March 23, 1945, casting long shadows through the pines as smoke drifted between the trees. The air smelled of cordite and damp earth, and somewhere in the distance, the rumble of artillery made the ground tremble beneath worn boots. In a hastily assembled command post, barely 2 miles from the German lines, a man stood rigid before a colonel whose face had turned the color of brick. The scout's name was Dalton Mercer, a lanky former ranch hand from eastern Montana who had traded his chaps for olive drab and his lasso for a rifle. His hands were filthy, his uniform torn at the shoulder, and his eyes held the kind of exhaustion that comes from 3 days without sleep. But there was something else in those eyes, too, something that made the colonel pause, even as his finger jabbed the air between them. Defiance. Not the reckless kind born of stupidity, but the quiet, immovable defiance of a man who knew he was right, even when everyone with rank and authority told him he was wrong. The colonel's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "You deliberately ignored direct orders, Mercer. You took it upon yourself to scout enemy positions beyond your designated sector. You could have compromised the entire advance." Dalton said nothing, just stood there with dirt under his fingernails, and the weight of his decision settling on his shoulders like an old blanket. Around them officers shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between the two men. No one in the 7th Infantry Division knew that this Cowboy Scout's unauthorized reconnaissance that morning had just prevented what would have been the bloodiest ambush in the entire Rhine crossing campaign. No one knew it yet, but they were about to find out. Dalton Mercer grew up in a place where the horizon stretched so far you could watch tomorrow arrive across the grasslands. His family ran cattle outside a town called Webo, right on the Montana-North Dakota border, where winter could kill you and summer could break you. And the only thing harder than the land was the people who stayed on it. His father had been a ranch foreman, a man of few words and fewer gestures, who taught Dalton to read terrain the way some men read books. Every ridge line told a story, every creek bed held information, every change in the wind carried meaning if you knew how to listen. Dalton learned to track deer through snow, to spot a lame horse from a quarter-mile away, and to find water where city folk saw only dust. He understood distance and patience and the subtle language of the land, in a way that no military manual could teach. When the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, Dalton was 19 years old, mending fence line on a freezing December morning. He heard about it 3 days later when he rode into town for supplies. The old men at the general store were talking about war and duty and defending the country, and Dalton listened quietly the way he always did, absorbing information, weighing it against what he knew of the world. He enlisted in February of 1942, not because of any grand patriotic speech or romantic notion of glory, but because it seemed like the thing a man did when his country called. He figured if he could handle Montana winters and ornery livestock, he could handle whatever the Army threw at him. Basic training proved to be an adjustment. The drill sergeants yelled constantly, which Dalton found mostly unnecessary, and the other recruits stumbled through exercises that seemed obvious to someone who had spent his life moving with purpose across difficult ground. He did not brag or show off, but he did not struggle either. When they ran obstacle courses, he moved with an economy of motion that came from years of climbing through barbed wire and jumping irrigation ditches. When they practiced land navigation, he found his way back to camp while others wandered in circles, cursing their compasses. His marksmanship scores were exceptional, not because he was naturally gifted with a rifle, but because he understood patience and breathing, and the way wind affected trajectory. Some of the other men called him the Cowboy, half mocking and half respectful, and the nickname stuck. By the time his unit shipped out to England in the autumn of 1943, Dalton had earned a quiet reputation as someone who did not need supervision in the field. He was assigned to reconnaissance duty, which suited him perfectly. While other soldiers dreaded the lonely, dangerous work of scouting ahead of advancing units, Dalton found it familiar. It was not so different from riding out alone to check on distant pastures, except the predators here wore uniforms and carried weapons. The war in Europe had reached a critical phase by the spring of 1945. Germany was collapsing from both east and west, but the Wehrmacht fought with the desperation of cornered wolves, making every river crossing and every forest a contested zone. The 7th Infantry Division, part of General Patch's 7th Army, had been tasked with pushing through southern Germany toward Munich, clearing out pockets of resistance and preventing German forces from establishing defensive lines in the Bavarian highlands. German units, though battered and undersupplied, knew the terrain intimately and used every advantage. They set ambushes in narrow forest roads, positioned snipers in church steeples, and placed obstacles at every likely approach. American intelligence was good but not perfect, and the speed of the advance meant that reconnaissance often fell to small teams of scouts who moved ahead of the main columns, reporting back on enemy positions and suitable routes. Dalton's reconnaissance team consisted of 3 other men. There was Harlan Beckett, a former logger from Oregon who could navigate thick timber like he was born to it; Silas Kowalski, a city kid from Detroit with a talent for mechanical improvisation; and Rafe Townsend, a soft-spoken farmhand from Iowa who had volunteered for scout duty. They trusted each other completely and had learned to read each other's signals without words. The mission briefing on March 22nd had been routine. Colonel Virgil Strathmore, the battalion commander, was a West Point graduate who ran his command with rigid adherence to doctrine and a deep suspicion of anything that smacked of improvisation. He was not a bad officer, just an inflexible one, the kind of man who believed that following procedure was the surest path to success. He laid out the plan with precision. The battalion would advance along a designated route through a forest sector that intelligence reported as lightly defended. Dalton's team was to scout the primary road and report back on any obstacles or enemy activity. They were explicitly ordered to stay within their assigned sector, not to exceed a reconnaissance depth of 2 miles, and to avoid engagement with the enemy if at all possible. Dalton listened carefully, studying the map on the colonel's field table. Something about the plan bothered him. The designated route followed a narrow valley between 2 ridgelines, the kind of terrain that made his instincts prickle with unease. In Montana, you avoided valleys when you could because they funneled you into places where you had no options. You took the high ground, even if it meant extra miles, because you could see what was coming. He thought about mentioning it, but held his tongue. Colonel Strathmore did not appreciate unsolicited advice from enlisted men. The briefing ended, and Dalton's team moved out before dawn. They moved slowly and carefully, using every bit of cover, pausing frequently to listen and observe. The forest was dense with pine and oak, the undergrowth thick with brush that made silent movement nearly impossible. Dalton led from the front, his senses tuned to the environment in a way that came from instinct and experience. Every bird call meant something. Every broken branch told a story. They reached the designated road by mid-morning and found it empty, just as intelligence had predicted. But something felt wrong. The forest was too quiet. There were no birds singing, no small animals rustling in the underbrush. It was the kind of silence that came when predators were near, the kind that made Dalton's skin tighten with awareness. He signaled for the team to halt and crouched beside a fallen log, studying the terrain ahead. According to their orders, they were supposed to advance another mile, verify that the route was clear, and then report back. But Dalton's instincts screamed at him to stop, to think, to look beyond what the map showed. He made a decision then that would have consequences he could not yet imagine. Instead of following the road as ordered, he led his team up the eastern ridgeline, climbing through thick brush and over fallen timber, gaining elevation as they paralleled the designated route. It was slow, exhausting work. and the rest of the team followed without question, trusting Dalton's judgment even though they were violating direct orders. It took them nearly 2 hours to reach a position where they could overlook the valley, but when they did, Dalton's blood went cold. Spread out below them, concealed in the forest on both sides of the road, was an entire German company, perhaps 150 soldiers, with at least 4 machine gun positions creating a devastating crossfire. There were mortar crews dug into the hillside, nearly invisible under camouflage netting. Anti-tank weapons covered the road from concealed positions that would have been impossible to spot from ground level. It was a textbook ambush, set with professional precision, waiting for the American column to march straight into the trap. If Colonel Strathmore had followed his plan, if the battalion had advanced along that road as ordered, the consequences would have been catastrophic. Dalton studied the enemy positions for 20 minutes, committing every detail to memory. He noted the location of each machine gun, the fields of fire, the probable positions of supporting elements he could not see. When he had seen enough, he led his team back down the ridge, moving even more carefully than before because now they carried information that the enemy would do anything to prevent from reaching American lines. Getting back proved harder than getting in. They had to cross a section of open ground where the forest thinned, and halfway across, a German patrol appeared less than 50 yards away. For one terrible moment, the two groups froze, staring at each other across the clearing. Then training and instinct took over. Dalton's team scattered into cover as the Germans reacted. Silas took a round through his pack that destroyed his canteen, but left him untouched. They could not afford a prolonged encounter. Dalton made a split-second decision. He stood up and moved aggressively toward the German position, creating noise and confusion to draw their attention while his team sprinted for cover. The Germans, surprised by the sudden movement, focused on him, giving the others the seconds they needed to reach safety. Dalton fired strategically, dove behind a fallen log, rolled to his feet, and ran after his team, zigzagging through the trees. They ran for 15 minutes, moving with desperate speed. The German patrol eventually gave up. By the time Dalton's team stumbled back into American lines, gasping for breath and covered in mud, it was mid-afternoon. They had been gone for nearly 10 hours, twice as long as expected, and they had violated every parameter of their orders. But they were alive, and they carried information that would save hundreds of lives. Colonel Strathmore's command post was a commandeered farmhouse with sandbags stacked around the windows. When Dalton and his team arrived, they were immediately ushered in to report. The colonel was reviewing maps with his staff when they entered, and the expression on his face shifted from relief to cold anger as Dalton began to explain what they had found. The more Dalton talked, the darker the colonel's expression became. He described the German positions in detail, sketching rough diagrams on the map to show the location of each machine gun nest and mortar position. He explained why the designated route would be a trap and recommended an alternate approach. Colonel Strathmore listened in silence until Dalton finished, and then his temper flared. "You deliberately ignored direct orders, Mercer. You were told to scout the designated route and report back. Instead, you took it upon yourself to conduct unauthorized reconnaissance beyond your sector. You exceeded your mission parameters by miles. You engaged the enemy in violation of explicit instructions. And now you have the audacity to stand here and tell me that our intelligence is wrong." Dalton tried again, keeping his voice respectful. "Sir, with respect, I am telling you what I saw. There is an entire German company dug in along that route, and if we advance as planned, the consequences will be severe." The meeting ended with Dalton and his team dismissed under a cloud of disapproval. As they left the command post, Harlan muttered, "He is going to get us all hurt." It was maddening and terrifying. And then something happened that no one expected. That evening, a captain from Division Intelligence arrived with new information. Aerial reconnaissance, delayed by weather, had finally been conducted over the target sector. The photographs confirmed everything Dalton had reported. The enemy positions were exactly where he had described them. The ambush was real, meticulously prepared, and positioned to inflict maximum damage. Colonel Strathmore sat in silence as the intelligence captain spread the aerial photographs across his field table. The evidence was undeniable. Every machine gun nest, every mortar position, every element of the German defensive scheme appeared exactly as the Cowboy scout had sketched them hours earlier. What happened next would become legend in the 7th Infantry Division. The following morning, March 23, 1945, Colonel Strathmore assembled his officers and senior non-commissioned officers in the farmyard outside his command post. It was unusual to call such a formation before a major advance, and the assembled men shifted nervously. When he spoke, his voice carried across the farmyard with clarity. "Gentlemen, I owe someone an apology." The assembled soldiers glanced at each other confused. Colonels did not apologize, certainly not publicly. Strathmore continued, his voice steady. "Yesterday, I reprimanded Scout Dalton Mercer for violating direct orders during a reconnaissance mission. I accused him of insubordination and recklessness. I suggested that his actions had compromised our position and endangered this battalion. I was wrong." The silence that followed was absolute. Subsequent intelligence has confirmed that Mercer's reconnaissance was accurate in every detail. The route we planned to advance along is, in fact, a prepared ambush. If we had followed our original plan, we would have marched straight into a trap. The consequences would have been catastrophic. He called out, "Scout Mercer, front and center." Dalton stepped forward and came to attention before the colonel. Strathmore met his eyes directly. "Mercer, your actions yesterday violated the letter of your orders but served their spirit. You used initiative and sound judgment under dangerous circumstances. Your reconnaissance prevented what would have been a disaster for this battalion. You saved lives, probably hundreds of them, and you did it by trusting your instincts when conventional wisdom suggested otherwise. I misjudged you, and I apologize for that misjudgment publicly, in front of these men who depend on both of us to make good decisions." Dalton stood rigid, unsure how to respond. Finally he managed, "Sir, I was just doing my job as I understood it." Strathmore almost smiled. "No, Mercer, you were doing more than your job. You were thinking independently, acting on information your training and experience told you was reliable, even when it contradicted official intelligence and direct orders. That takes courage." The colonel turned to address the assembled men again. "Our advance will proceed, but along an alternate route that will bypass the enemy ambush. Thanks to Mercer's reconnaissance, we know where the enemy is strong and where they are vulnerable. You are hereby commended for exceptional reconnaissance. I am recommending you for the Bronze Star. And going forward, if you see something that does not match your understanding of the terrain or the enemy, I want you to tell me, even if it contradicts what I think I know." The revised advance proceeded on March 24th, taking a safer route that circled the German ambush positions. The battalion met resistance, but nothing like what they would have faced in the valley. American artillery, directed by Dalton's coordinates, engaged the German positions before the assault began. The battalion achieved its objectives with light losses. In his after-action report, Colonel Strathmore wrote a detailed account of how unauthorized reconnaissance had prevented potential disaster. The report became a case study in the importance of ground truth over paper intelligence. The incident changed Colonel Strathmore. He learned to listen to his scouts with more respect, to question intelligence reports with healthy skepticism, and to remember that military doctrine existed to serve victory, not the other way around. The war in Europe ended 6 weeks later. Dalton returned to Montana in the autumn of 1945, trading his uniform back for work clothes. He never talked much about the war. He married a schoolteacher named Iris in 1947, a woman who understood that some silences did not need filling. They built a modest life together on a small ranch outside Glendive. Dalton worked for Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks for 30 years, teaching land navigation and survival skills to rangers who were amazed at how this quiet man could read landscapes. He never told them about Bavaria or colonels who apologized. But sometimes, late at night, he would remember the weight of that moment when he had to decide whether to follow orders or follow his instincts. He never regretted the choice he made. Years later, Dalton received a letter from Curtis Wainwright, a former lieutenant in the 7th Infantry Division, who would have been in the first wave down that valley if the plan had not changed. At a reunion, he had heard the story and realized he would have been in extreme danger on March 24, 1945, if not for one man's unauthorized reconnaissance. The letter thanked Dalton with profound gratitude. Wainwright had lived a full life since the war, and all of it existed because a Montana ranch hand had climbed a ridge when he was supposed to stay on a road. Dalton kept that letter in his desk drawer for the rest of his life. He received others over the years, men who had been in that battalion writing to say they existed because of what he had done. Colonel Strathmore went on to a distinguished career, eventually retiring as a brigadier general. In his memoir, he devoted an entire chapter to the incident, framing it as a turning point in his understanding of leadership. The chapter became required reading at the Army War College. Army reconnaissance procedures were revised to give scouts more latitude in reporting unexpected activity. Training manuals began emphasizing the importance of ground truth over paper intelligence. The changes saved lives in later conflicts. Dalton Mercer passed away peacefully in 2003 at the age of 80. His funeral was attended by family, friends, and people who had heard the story and wanted to pay respects to a man who embodied quiet competence and moral courage. Among them were Harlan and Rafe, both elderly, but still remembering that desperate run through the Bavarian forest and the vindication that followed. They talked about how Dalton had never bragged, never sought recognition. But his quiet competence had been the difference between survival and disaster for hundreds of men. The courage to be right when everyone with authority told you that you were wrong. The courage to report what you saw even when you knew you would be criticized. The courage to prioritize mission over ego. That kind of courage was harder to recognize because it did not come with dramatic gestures. It came in the form of a quiet man climbing a ridge when he was supposed to stay on a road. The story continued to circulate through military circles, evolving into a parable about leadership and initiative. It became a teaching story for new scouts, a reminder that sometimes the most important skill is understanding when orders are based on bad information and having the integrity to report what you actually see. Dalton was remembered as proof that individual choices matter, that one person with integrity and courage can change outcomes in ways that ripple forward through time. The lives saved on that March day were lived fully, and the impact of one unauthorized reconnaissance continued to multiply in ways that could never be calculated. That was the real legacy. Would you have climbed that ridge when orders told you to stay on the road? Would you have reported what you saw even knowing you would be criticized? Would you have stood in that farmyard and apologized to an enlisted man in front of your entire command? These are fundamental questions about the kind of person you are, because organizations are only as good as the individuals who comprise them, and those individuals are constantly making choices about whether to follow rules or follow conscience, whether to protect ego or serve mission. The story that began in a Bavarian forest on March 23, 1945, continues every day wherever people face the choice between comfortable compliance and difficult truth. Comment below if this story moved you. Share it so others can remember what real courage looks like. Because the example of a cowboy scout and a colonel who apologized reminds us that individuals still shape history, one choice at a time. and that the most important battles are often won by people who refuse to follow orders that lead toward disaster.